I'm not going to waste too much time because one of the most, or let's say two of the most valuable commodities at conferences like this is coffee. Since we've skipped the coffee break, we can actually have more time. So let's kick it off. And I'd like to start off with you, Professor Burhanettin Duran. You and I had the pleasure of actually being on the same panel last year.
My pleasure as well.
You have a new title this year, and I think I was going to do a short intro in terms of the history of Turkey's diplomatic evolution, and I said I can't do better than you. So since you are the most qualified, if you can sort of set the stage for us in terms of highlighting some of the diplomatic initiatives that Turkey has taken, especially under the leadership of President Erdoğan.
Well, thank you, Alican. Well, of course, Turkey is playing an increasingly active role in this peace-building efforts and diplomatic initiatives. And this is mainly because of President Erdoğan's strong leadership and his proactive diplomacy in the last 2 decades. Well, I can tell you that this is basically related to leadership diplomacy concept. You know, President Erdoğan has some engagement with world leaders, and this is making him very credible as a prominent pioneer of peaceful resolution of conflicts, from the Russian-Ukraine war to Ethiopian and Somali problem. So this is, I can tell you that the first aspect is leadership diplomacy. And the second one, of course, which is very related to President Erdoğan's understanding of international system, there are 2 aspects to that. One is Turkey is trying to strengthen institutional mechanisms for peaceful affairs. I mean, you know, in mediation issues, Turkey is leading with Finland some mediation efforts regarding the UN, OICE, OCI. These are the very critical aspects that Turkey tries to strengthen institutional mechanisms. And the second one is Turkey's criticism towards the UN system. As you know, President Erdoğan is speaking in a high voice about the reform of the UN system. The world is bigger than 5, or we need a fairer world. So maybe the third aspect is about Turkey's policy regarding the surrounding regions. Turkey tries to provide stability and security in the neighboring countries, and also in the African continent it is the same. And all of these 3 aspects, which are influencing Turkey's international role as an influential actor. I mean, you know, I see that when I visit African capitals, all these countries are regarding Turkey as a new influential actor, because Turkey tries to provide stability and security for their countries, and this is based on win-win approach. And many diplomats are telling us that we need Turkey much more than before, and Turkey is trying to change the atmosphere, political atmosphere, international atmosphere for the African countries. So these are very related to Turkey's mediation efforts and diplomatic initiatives under President Erdoğan.
We're definitely going to follow up on the UN thing, but because President Erdoğan, as you all remember, during his opening speech, he had some quite powerful comments when it comes to the permanent 5 members, but I'll ask you in just a bit. Natalie, Professor Duran was talking about, he made a reference to, we need Turkey more than ever. When you look at sort of Turkey's membership in various international organizations, Let's just put NATO out there for a second. What do you think its implications are in terms of its role as being a mediator in global crises?
So let me make two sets of remarks. I mean, the first is more relevant to Turkey and its foreign policy, and the second as it relates to the EU, especially at this point in time in which enlargement is really coming back on the agenda. So I think as far as Turkey's foreign policy, what is most interesting to me is the way in which more than other European countries, and I specify other European countries of which Turkey is one, its foreign policy has had the ability to read, to adapt, and at times even to anticipate changes in the international system. So, the old story of the Cold War and the way in which Turkey was a bulwark against Soviet expansionism during the Cold War. The period of, the liberal international order, the end of the Cold War, the end of history, and the way in which Turkey opened up, right? I mean, its foreign policy was premised on openness. It was premised on the idea that interdependence, free trade, both looking at the South and looking at the East, and of course continuing to look to the West, was really a premise of its foreign policy. And the way in which indeed it was precisely in this period that its association with the European Union transformed into a process of accession to the European Union. Then you basically go through, and this is where it really starts becoming more innovative to the extent that it starts anticipating the times. I would say that whereas the rest of Europe didn't quite see the way in which we were passing the peak of the unipolar moment and entering, in a sense, a world of multipolarity, Turkey in many respects anticipated that, right? I mean, it started understanding that power was shifting within the international system, and so its foreign policy adapted correspondingly. Now we're at a time in which, I'm not even sure we can call it multipolarity, it is a time of fracture. It's a time of fracture between the global West and the global East, as well as between the global North and the global South. So in this context of fracture, what is the role that Turkey is playing? 2 points on opportunities and perhaps two challenges. On the two opportunities, one was already being mentioned by Burhanettin, and it is basically the point of mediation, right? I mean, if you are at a time of fracture, the role that a country like Turkey can play is precisely that of mediating. And there have been plenty of examples as of late, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the prisoners exchange deals between Russia and Ukraine. So it is clear that there is a potential role to be played there. I think on top of it, in a world which is not quite multipolar, but in many respects is kind of non-polar, and in which the role of the global South, and in particular what I would define as the power South, is emerging, Turkey is one of those players, right? And is really kind of using that potential leverage not to fit in either one camp or the other. But there are two challenges, and this is really where I wanted to end. The first really has to do with the fact that interdependence, on which Turkey's foreign policy was premised, is no longer as attractive as it once was, right? I mean, it used to be considered a source of prosperity, perhaps not quite a guarantee of peace, but at the very least, a factor that could mitigate the most extreme manifestations of conflict. That world has gone, right? Interdependence today is viewed much more as a potential security threat. What role can Turkey play, given that it belongs to a power South, and given that much of its growth was actually premised on leveraging those interdependencies? What role can Turkey play in saving, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Saving what was good of that open world. So that's one challenge and question mark. And the second is, and it goes back to this question of mediation, what role can Turkey play in those conflicts where it risks becoming entangled in the dynamics of the conflict itself? And let me just make one example, which is not the one you're thinking of, and it actually has to do with the Caucasus, right? Here we are in a world in which, and I'd love them to hear also Matt's views on this, but here we are in a world in which one particular conflict has kind of settled into a new equilibrium. But we haven't quite clinched a peace deal, right? And obviously I'm talking about Armenia and Azerbaijan. What is the role that Turkey could play, not to remain entangled within that conflict dynamic, but actually being part of and perhaps even pushing its friend and ally Azerbaijan to make and capitalize, in a sense, on the deal that it could make, and not, may I add, make the same mistake that Armenia made for 30 years, not capitalizing on its victory when it was on the winning side of the equation. So that's, to me, in a sense, the challenge that I'd like to put on the table. But perhaps, given that you were asking me about EU accession, a very, very final note on that. It is very clear that EU accession is back on the agenda. And it is very clear that it has been revived by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what this means is that what has revived the enlargement process is a security/strategic rationale, which is a different rationale from the one in which Turkey was part of, right? When it had momentum in its own accession process. It was a different world, right? So, in a sense, Turkey now finds itself both with an opportunity but also with a bit of a problem. The opportunity because obviously it has, and I think it was implicit in your question, a lot to bring strategically, right? Yeah. So if the enlargement process is driven by a geostrategic logic, Turkey, given its role in Europe and in the world, can actually bring something to the table. However, if it's a security rationale which is driving enlargement, in a sense, Turkey doesn't really need it, right? Yeah. Let me sort of make the obvious case here. In the case of Ukraine and Moldova, it's their non-membership of NATO which makes EU membership, in a sense, a surrogate, right? Not quite the same, but a surrogate. Turkey doesn't need that, yeah? I mean, there isn't that same security imperative which is eventually driving a revival of its own enlargement process. So, in what way can both Brussels and Ankara, on the one hand, leverage a rationale which is reviving enlargement, which is geostrategic in nature, but on the other hand, not fall into the trap of the fact that given that it isn't security that is eventually driving Turkey's membership of the European Union, not capitalizing on that momentum which is actually being revived now.
And that's something that we'll follow with Professor Duran in just a bit. But since you mentioned, or one of the things that you mentioned was the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think it's a perfect time to bring in Matthew Bryza. For those of you, if you don't know, Matthew Bryza served as the U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan a while ago. Matthew, Natalie was also talking about the conflict in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. Talk to me about how unique it is for Turkey to be maintaining a relationship with its Western allies, but also its non-Western allies, and what Natalie was also saying, being a member of the global South, the global power group. So it's unique.
Yeah, it's really unusual, and I think a result of incredibly skillful diplomacy and strategic vision, to be honest. In Washington, we used to, by the way, I was also the mediator of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, so, I visited Armenia a hell of a lot as well. And we often didn't appreciate the strategic vision that Turkey showed, because often Turkey speaks quietly and acts and does things. So in the case of Azerbaijan, Armenia in the Second Karabakh War, there wasn't a lot of rhetoric out of Turkey, but it provided critical, not only drone support, but tactics, and helping the Azerbaijani side understand how to bring together both drone capacity to develop real-time intelligence, and then use standoff weapons to have an impact on the battlefield. So there wasn't a lot of rhetoric, there was action. When it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how, the role Turkey has played, it is unique. I mean, coming from a Washington background, though I've lived here the last 13 years, Washington often expects NATO allies sort of to follow its lead, right? And so if the United States has decided that it's going to impose sanctions on Russia, and the other NATO allies have, there's an expectation that Turkey will as well. But quietly, Ankara was able to do much more. Ankara was able to express very strong support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, continuously has condemned the invasion, but has not joined sanctions. Turkey also provided crucial military technical support to Ukraine, especially in the beginning. I mean, one reason why Russia was unable to capture Kyiv in the early days of its invasion was thanks to the TB2 drones of Turkey that played a crucial role on the battlefield. And Turkey has done more to help Ukraine militarily. But it also has kept the channels of communication open to Moscow. It's avoided harsh rhetoric, it's avoided excessive condemnation, and President Erdogan has cultivated the ability to talk to Putin when need be. And as Natalie said, that has resulted in something great. That resulted in the grain deal in July of 2022. That resulted in one of the largest prisoner exchanges in recent decades, when 26 detainees or prisoners were swapped, including one very close friend of mine, Vladimir Kara-Murza, but also Evan Gershkovich, the journalist, and the former head, or the head of Memorial Human Rights Group, Oleg Orel. And so what happened in those situations was Ankara, Turkey remained anchored in the West and in NATO. I mean, Turkey has NATO's second largest military. It's the only military, by the way, that has confronted Russia on the battlefield that I can remember ever, and that happened in Idlib when Russia was violating the protection agreement that it had agreed with Turkey. Russia was doing that together with Assad's forces, led to an aerial strike by Russian forces and Assad's forces on Turkish troops. Some were killed. Turkey responded in a decisive way that stabilized for a long time that conflict. There haven't been those sorts of clashes since. So Turkey has proven skillful at, standing on principle, supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but not overdoing it. Keeping the channels of communication open with Russia, even though sometimes Turkey has felt a need to use military force as a tool of diplomacy. Because remember, as von Clausewitz taught us all, war is a continuation of politics by other means. So military capabilities, when used appropriately, are tools of diplomacy. They're tools shaping the negotiating outcome of whatever the conflict is. So in the case of Ukraine, these accomplishments I just mentioned are, they're unique in my experience. And that's been the result of a combination of, yes, in the background, extreme military capability, 2, standing on principle, but 3, avoiding excessive and confrontational rhetoric, while finally keeping the communication channels open with the national leader. So they're in Turkey has remained a strong member of NATO, but sort of sometimes crosses the expected lines when it comes to communication, and that's proven to be quite valuable.
Matthew, thank you. Bruno, thank you for your patience. I do have to apologize to you. Sort of in the heat of the moment, I forgot to sort of introduce you. I just said your name and I called you up on stage. Bruno is the former Secretary of State for Europe in Portugal. You're also with the Flint Global, a senior advisor there. You've authored many acclaimed books, and you also advise some leading companies, some of the world's leading companies when it comes to geopolitics. Since we're talking about geopolitics, is it just geography that puts Turkey in this unique positions? I'm wondering if you could sort of maybe perhaps expand on some of the factors that actually gives Turkey this title.
Yeah, it isn't just geography. It may not even be the most important factor. I think it's a lot to do with history. It has a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do with a certain understanding of politics. Let me give a few examples. I think one of the fundamental roles that Turkey has been playing is to be a kind of gadfly to the West. And by gadfly, I mean a critical conscience, which the West is in dire need of at the moment. And I think this is possible because historically, for centuries, Turkey has played this role of being both inside and outside. And in order to be a critical consciousness, you need to have that position. So we've seen over the past year and 3 months what President Erdogan called not just the mass killing of children, but the destruction of the world legal system as it exists. And the past week or two were a good example of this. I just came back from Berlin, a conference very similar to this one, talked to a number of German decision makers. None of them was very clear about where Germany is going to fall on the question of the ICC arrest warrant. I couldn't get any of them to tell me that they will, in fact, they are ready to arrest Netanyahu if he visits Germany. But think about it. A country like Germany that was founded on, it's in the Constitution, in the federal Constitution from 1949, that was founded on the principles of international humanitarian law, is now ready to jettison all those principles in the name of we know not what, but in some sense just a kind of collective mania that stops the country from understanding what it is and where the world is. This I know, I won't go into more details, but it's an example of where we are. And clearly the role of Turkey over the past year has been precisely calling attention to these grave moral, political, and legal failings that we have in the West. I think Turkey was ready to do this because, in fact, he had been calling attention to these problems for a long time. I think historically, culturally, Turkey is not as attracted by the idea of a civilizational war as people perhaps in Europe and the United States are. Look, I have been extremely critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I consider it a barbaric, unjustified act. But I have a little trouble understanding why we so quickly concluded that it was not possible to talk to Russia, that it was not possible to have any kind of contacts. I used to travel to Russia a lot, and I'm not embarrassed to admit it, because if you write about geopolitics, you have to meet people and travel to places. But, you know, I stopped, but everyone who used to do it was immediately criticized, as if it is some kind of sin to try to understand things on the ground. And obviously, every Western politician until 2 weeks ago stopped all kind of contact. I think Turkey understands that the world is made of people you like, people you don't like. It will always be like that. Talking to someone does not mean that you approve of his or her actions. But if your mental framework is that we are in a civilizational war and the other side will eventually disappear and we'll move to a world where we can all agree, then it is some kind of sin to slow down the process by having contacts with the other side. So I think this different framework also allowed Turkey to play a different kind of role. And finally, very quickly, there is this combination of words and action, because I always like to remember that it was in fact Turkey that started to contain and balance Russian power. It wasn't the speeches at Western think tanks. It was Turkey's actions in Syria and Turkey's actions in the Caucasus that provided a very necessary balance to Russian power. Russian power was too dominant in the Caucasus and threatened to overrun Syria. And in that case, it wasn't Europe, it wasn't in the United States. It was a kind of, in some respects, small-scale interventions, but that provided some kind of balance. We'll see what happens in Syria today and tomorrow. But some kind of balance that I think prevented the worst possible outcomes, particularly in Syria. So there was also, I think, a cultural understanding that words by themselves are not enough. They have to be combined with action. But action in a world that is always going to be divided, that is always going to be fragmented, and where this hope that we're all going to become the same is a misguided hope. I think it's better understood here that it is a misguided hope or illusion, let me call it that.
Mr. Deputy Minister, Bruno was mentioning, Turkey is both on the inside, It's both on the outside, the world is made up of people that you like, it's also made up of the people that you don't like. As a senior member of the Turkish state when it comes to foreign policy, if you could maybe talk about how the country navigates or perhaps balances this complex dynamics when it comes to maintaining relationships with your neighbors on the one hand, but also being a mediator when it comes to global crises. It seems it can be a difficult balancing act.
Sure. Well, you're right. It's a difficult and complicated diplomatic effort. Well, first of all, thank you for Natalie and Matthew and Bruno for mentioning different aspects of Turkey's uniqueness of the Turkey's policies. Well, just to understand how unique is this, I have to mention some aspects of Turkish foreign policy by referring to some examples. First, Turkey tries to promote some new concepts which are presented as solutions to the growing problems of the international system. Like what? Like regional ownership. Turkey wants to see the paramountcy of regional ownership in the surrounding regions. That's why we are having good relations at the same time with both together with the Balkans or the South Caucasus and Middle East and North Africa at the same time. And we are trying to strike a balance between Ukraine and Russia. Actually, we are not neutral. We are supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We have good strategic relations, but at the same time, we are not applying the sanction imposed unilaterally on Russia. Yeah. So this is something new. How could be done? Turkey actually tries to manifest a new kind of understanding that is composed of adaptability to the changing conditions. I mean, there is a new world coming. That is asymmetric multipolarity. And you have to deal with the challenges coming from this reality. And in the last 2 decades, Turkey is trying to deal with all of them, from terrorism to migration, or some conflicts over trade issues, supply chains, energy issue. All of them are related to Turkey in any way, in different ways. Yeah. So you have to be resilient. And that is something that I want to mention here, adaptability and resilience. And you have to create some new forms of multilateralism and regionalism. Yes, you may have some international organizations, but they are not working properly. You cannot get rid of them. You have to strengthen them by criticizing them at the same time. That's the way Turkey tries to do. But at the same time, Turkey's involvement in terms of hard power is very specific and some policy-oriented. Just to give an example, in Libya and Karabakh, Turkey was successful enough in turning this involvement into something stable, secure, and mutually benefiting. I mean, this should be an act of stability, not an act of any other further conflicts. We are seeing this in Libya. Now we are, of course, for the national government, a unity government, but at the same time, we are trying to bring East and West in Libya together. Although we were a part of the West side, we were supporting the West. So that's an example. It is the same in South Caucasus. Yes, we supported Azerbaijan in Karabakh, but at the same time, we are trying to turn this into a kind of peace and stability in the region. So this kind of dynamism is also manifested in our normalization with different countries from the Gulf and from Egypt. So we are promoting this normalization into new partnership that we are coming together and we understand each other much more than before. So this is, in a way, a response to the coming chaotic, multipolar world. So, of course, Turkey cannot solve all of these problems. But this represents a new model for dealing with the coming chaotic world. So that is the way this dynamism, this resilience, this actually elasticity in terms of forming new policies, all of them are the real secrets of the uniqueness for Turkey's foreign policy. That's why we can strike a balance, a mediation role between Russia and Ukraine or Ethiopia and Somalia. We are not neutral, but we can establish trust and confidence, and then we know our limits, our capacity, but we are there for strengthening their capacity to solve their problems. We know our limits, we know our capacity, but we are there for also their own interests. Yeah. Not just we are trying to divert the issue just only for our benefits. I believe that this is something out of the experience of the 2 decades under the leadership of President Erdoğan.
Matthew, I know that you want to follow up.
Yeah, I'm sorry to step out of line, but to make it interactive, you, Mr. Deputy Minister, triggered something in my mind that's very practical. I spend most of my time now in the business world and at the intersection, as I was telling Natalie, of geopolitics and business. And so my company was very interested in Somaliland. And there's a deep water port there, and Ethiopia now has reached an agreement, right, whereby with Somaliland, where Ethiopia will recognize Somaliland's independence in exchange for access to this port. Ethiopia lost its access to the sea when it lost Eritrea, right? And this port in Somaliland, that is a really important point. I mean, it's at the gates of the Red Sea, right next to the Bandar al-Mandab Strait. That's where the Houthis have wreaked havoc on shipping. So some of the people in my company said, well, it would be very advantageous to us if we could support Somalia in its quest for independence. And I said, oh, but wait. I live in Turkey. Turkey has worked so hard to develop a strategic relationship with Somalia. Somaliland, as the name suggests, is a breakaway region of Somalia. President Erdoğan, right, he was the first non-African head of state to visit Somalia in like 20 years.
In 2011.
In 2011. And after that, Turkey has trained military forces, the elite forces in Somalia, offered all sorts of economic assistance. So I said to my colleagues, no. Don't even think about this project we could do in Somaliland because it's, where I live, Ankara is going to be really angry. And then what happened? Turkey then tried to broker understanding between Somalia and Ethiopia. So tried to tone down the tensions and from a very pragmatic point of view, make it work for everybody. So in Washington, where I spent so much of my professional life growing up, there is a sense now that when Turkey is acting, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's being aggressive or confrontational. But this example shows, no, of course Turkey is pursuing its strategic interest in the Horn of Africa, but it's also trying to quiet down the tensions. Even if it looks like a particular step, like Somaliland's independence, could be against the interests of Turkey's core friend in the Horn, which is Somalia.
But in Washington, it may be perceived as an aggressive policy, but the Deputy Minister talked about resilience, talked about adaptiveness. I think another adjective that he used was elasticity. And these are all sort of very important characteristics to have in diplomacy. But it's not the only one in a country's sort of arsenal when it comes to sort of exerting force on the international stage. We briefly talked about it, and I think there is an economic angle to a lot of these conflicts that Turkey's playing a mediating role. Talk to me the importance about that, besides diplomacy, using economy as a tool. Matthew, maybe briefly start off with you, and then we'll go to you, Natalie.
Sure. I mean, the way I got my start in this part of the world was energy pipelines, oil and gas pipelines from Azerbaijan through Georgia here to Turkey, which eventually became, at least the natural gas part, the Southern Corridor. Which, by the way, it took a long time for our friends, especially in Berlin, but also throughout Europe, to embrace, because they thought the approach was going to be too confrontational toward Russia. But Ankara, having fought, or Turkey having fought more wars against Russia than against any other country, dating back to the Ottoman period, understands that you have to find a way to be firm and pursue your interests, whether or not Russia likes it, but not in a confrontational way. So we quietly but decisively for years, Ankara, Washington, Tbilisi, Baku, simply kept moving forward, developing with the companies and countries these huge multi-billion-dollar investments that exist today that are highly profitable and that have bound those countries together also with European allies in Italy, for example, via the Trans-Adriatic pipeline under the Adriatic Sea.
Yeah.
Pass the ball to Italy.
Yeah, like TANAP, the middle corridor, how do these all sort of play in terms of exerting influence?
I mean, look, let me put it in these terms. I mean, the way in which, and I love the way in which Bruno sort of characterized it as, you know, sort of a country that, you know, is kind of in and out, right? It's neither nor, right? Or it's either, you know, both this and that, yeah? Which is probably a better way of putting it. I think this has, and I think it's important to emphasize, on the one hand, it has real potential value, and we've talked about this, right? I mean, it has the value of dialogue, it has the value of mediation, it has the value of connectivity, and this is where the story of infrastructure, for instance, comes in. But I think it's important to also emphasize that there are risks. I mean, it's an uncomfortable position to be in. It's far more comfortable to be either in one camp or in the other, right? I mean, when you are straddling, you're constantly uncomfortable by definition. And what is that discomfort, or rather, what are the risks? And I think it's important to also talk about the risks. There is the risk of transactionalism, right? I mean, you know, not choosing could end up being interpreted as openness and dialogue, but it could also end up being interpreted as kind of opportunism and transactionalism. And let me give you another example, which is not related to Turkey at all. Germany, right? I mean, sort of Bruno was talking about Germany in another context, talking particularly in reference to the Middle East. Let's talk about Germany. Let's go back, you know, 10 years ago. And think about the way in which, for instance, Germany was trying to understand itself and talk about why it was pursuing Nord Stream 2. It would have talked about it, you know, let's rewind back 10 years ago, it would have talked about it in a way which is not dissimilar to the way in which we're talking about it now. Yes, of course, you know, there had just been the annexation of Crimea. Yes, of course, you know, Russia is a complicated player, but, you know, we're for openness and we have to keep channels of communication. The truth of the matter in retrospect is that it was opportunism, full stop, right? And so I say this not to try to somehow argue that, you know, Turkey is doing the same thing, but to say that in that condition of discomfort, of straddling, of being, you know, both this and that, there is on the one hand value, but there is also risk, right? And I think it's always important to look at that risk and being honest with ourselves and asking ourselves, why is it we're doing it? Are we doing it because we're open and we want dialogue? Or are we doing it because there's something cynical and opportunistic about it? And to the extent that it's the latter, always remember that things can turn very quickly, right? And I think that's something that we should always bear in mind.
Natalie, thank you. Bruno, I sort of maybe want to expand on what Natalie was saying, talking about the value proposition and then the potential risks involved. Specifically when it comes to the example of Türkiye, talk to me about some of the potential risks as the country grows in its influence in diplomacy and in the field of economy.
Yes, let me turn a little bit to the economy. So the risk, I think, would be that in a world that is fragmenting into separate blocks, you can only prosper economically if you're a full member of one of the blocks, simply because the barriers between the blocks will be too deep and too difficult to cross. So, you know, to be more concrete, you could make the argument that in the end, Turkey will have to be forced to choose whether it wants to be a full member of the European single market or not. Because even having a customs union creates all sorts of problems when you want to sign free trade agreements with third countries. Now, some people think this is not the case. Some people think that in the new era, you could potentially be able to navigate these conflicts and, in fact, trade and do business with different blocs, not being fully committed to any of them, and taking advantage of growth opportunities that are everywhere. And the argument would be that, in fact, it's maybe too late for Turkey to associate itself completely with the European Union because the European Union is on an economic decline path, and therefore Turkey has to find opportunities elsewhere. And one issue that is very alive right now here, from what I understand, is the possibility of a free trade agreement with Japan. I think this sort of points the way. I'm more on the side of those who think that it's possible to have close economic links with different blocs. I see that many countries have been extremely successful doing this. I think that perhaps Switzerland, Singapore can offer an example for what Turkey can do. And I think after this first phase where the attempt was more political to appear as a mediator in the realm of politics, that perhaps there can be a second phase where Turkey will do the same in the realm of world trade and help, in fact, bring some of these blocs together by continuing to stand for trade, business, economic links. I know that Natalie warned us to the risk that if you go with too much enthusiasm down one path, it could sacrifice your principles. But I think it's possible to do both. And it's possible to, in fact, use the same emphasis on stability, order, balance, which I think it was the three words that I got from your comments: stability, order, balance. And that this is more... And cooperation as a tool of that. Yeah. And that these three values can also be applied to the economic sphere, not just to the political sphere.
Okay. Bruno, thank you very much. I see that they've put on a timer. Thank you very much for that. So we're running out of time. I do want to give the Deputy Minister the final word in the sense of especially making a reference to what President Erdogan said, need for reform at the United Nations. How does the country Turkey use its experience as a mediator when it comes to global crises to advocate for urgent reform in international bodies like the United Nations, but not only specifically that?
Well, yes, Alican, you mentioned something very difficult because, yes, Turkey is trying to voice some normatives, some norms that are very relevant to the international system, just as reforming Security Council. This is gaining a momentum. Many people, many politicians are now accepting that this system should be reformed. But how? That is the crux of the matter. You know, after the Israeli genocide in Gaza, international norms are in erosion. So we have to create a new system, a new international order, which is very clear now. But we need to initiate, we want and we need to initiate some new forms of multilateralisms. That's the way, personally, I see the solution. Because nobody can afford the coming chaotic multipolar world and their risks and their problems. So, as I said, we know that just Turkey cannot solve all the problems, or some problems around us. We should come together, we should create some cooperation, and we should create some agreements on international norms as well. That's why Turkey is at the same time, and President Erdoğan is speaking about this issue of reform. Without this, it is the jungle, and the great power rivalries and their repercussions on us and in the surrounding region could be disastrous. You know, we should be realistic about that. That's why we are talking so much diplomatically.
True. Thank you very much. You know, it's a huge disservice, I do have to say, when you have people of this caliber to be limited to 45 minutes. I do apologize, but we've come to the end of our session. Nelly Toci, thank you very much. Matthew Bryza, Deputy Foreign Minister Burhanettin Duran, and Bruno Masayesh, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists.